I have the pleasure today of introducing the keynote speaker, Professor Theodore Shaw. He is the Julius Chambers Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of North Carolina School of Law in Chapel Hill, and he also serves as the director of the UNC Center for Civil Rights. Professor Shaw teaches civil procedure and advanced constitutional law and the 14th Amendment. Before joining the faculty at the UNC Law School, he taught at various law schools around the country, including the University of Michigan Law School and Columbia School of Law. He also currently serves as a member of the faculty of the Practicing Law Institute, which is involved in educating practicing lawyers. So he gets the students and then he gets the lawyers, and he trains both on each end. Professor Shaw's legal career began as a trial attorney in the honors program of the United States Department of Justice in the Civil Rights Division in Washington, D.C., where he worked from 1979 until 1982. And from there, he joined the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund, where he worked in various capacities over the span of 26 years. And during that time, he directed the Legal Defense Fund's education litigation docket, and after 5 years in that position, he was moved to Los Angeles to establish the Legal Defense Fund's Western Regional Office. And from there, he left the Legal Defense Fund to work as a law school professor for a number of years. And then he returned to the Legal Defense Fund to serve as its associate director and counsel. And in 2004, he became its 5th Director-Counsel. He has litigated education, employment, voting rights, housing, police misconduct, capital punishment, and other civil rights cases in trial and appellate courts, and as well as in the United States Supreme Court. He also has served on the Obama transition team after the 2008 presidential election as a team leader for the Civil Rights Division of the Justice Department. We are extremely fortunate today to have such a distinguished advocate to speak. Please join me in welcoming Professor Theodore Shaw.
Thank you very much. I'm honored to be here. But when I'm among legal aid folks and fair housing folks and folks who are committed to the issues you're committed to, I'm very much at home. I want to thank you for the recognition for the work that the center does. And I want to share some thoughts about the experiences I've had with fair housing issues. Some of it I want to reflect in a personal way on some issues, and I also then want to say a few words about the thoughts I have about the environment in which we find ourselves in these days. But before I do that, I want to once again recognize the staff of the center because these are extraordinary lawyers, extraordinary folks who are deeply committed to issues of racial justice and fairness for all. And they don't get the recognition that they deserve, and they're under fire right now. And that's the nature of the beast, I suppose. But I'd like them to stand and be acknowledged. So would you all do that? I was thinking, and I don't want to be misunderstood, I was thinking that, you know, I get up and speak, and, you know, people say all kinds of things, but your family and the people you work with and the people who know you up close know you for better and worse. You know, it's that saying in the Bible about a prophet is not without honor save in his own country. And I'm not even a prophet. So I'm conscious of that it could be any one of the staff up here at this moment speaking. But I've been asked to do it, and so I will. I grew up in public housing in the Bronx, in a large public housing project that was consciously racially integrated when it was opened. That was an exception among many public housing projects because, as many of you know, the role of public housing in this country has been intertwined with social policy and political policy that has been tainted with race and racism. Public housing, when it was first created in the 1930s, was intentionally segregated by race. And it was public policy at the federal level and public policy at the state level and at the local level with respect to public housing, but not only public housing, housing in general. You all know the story. Certainly those of you who are lawyers or went to law school know the story about the role of government in segregating housing. I was thinking last Sunday, because I do go to church, of Martin Luther King's statement that he made many times, that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in America. Martin Luther King has been dead now for almost 50 years. And it is as true now as it was when he was alive. So it's not only government, but it's the institutions that we know and we belong to in our daily lives, whether they are religious institutions, churches and mosques and synagogues, whatever they might be, but also government playing a leading role. It's been pointed out, it's been documented, people have written about it, thinking about Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton, who published a book some years ago called American Apartheid, that racial segregation in housing and in communities around this country didn't come to be what it is accidentally, or depending on one's point of view, depending on how one sees those issues, serendipitously. It was the consequence of conscious choices and policies on the state, federal, and local levels that created segregation that we see today. And while much has changed, the legacy of that segregation still remains with us. So when we think about neighborhoods that had restrictive covenants, some of those neighborhoods have become more desegregated, but some of those neighborhoods, even though restrictive covenants have not been legal since 1968, also look almost the way they did prior to 1948. I said 68, but 48, of course, was Shelley versus Kramer, in which the Supreme Court struck down restrictive covenants. But we also know that the federal government played a role when it supported or underwrote the suburbanization process in America post-World War II, as the country came out of the Depression, lifted out of the Depression through war. And then when the soldiers came home, there were all kinds of benefits, including not only educational benefits, but the ability to buy homes. And the Federal Housing Administration explicitly underwrote those opportunities through racially segregated policies and practices. They would not underwrite mortgages in racially heterogeneous neighborhoods. In the area in which I grew up, if you're not familiar with this community, it's very famous and infamous depending on how one looks at it. But in Long Island, there's a huge development that became the paragon of middle-class life. And if you were to go and look at the photographs of those communities, the aerial photographs, you get a sense of how significant that was. But it wasn't only Levittown, but it was Levittowns across the country. And we could talk about other actions that the federal government took to underwrite and to guarantee segregation. But I'm conscious of the limitations of time. It's just fair enough to say that segregation in America, when we drive on highways through communities, most people don't think about how those communities came to look the way they do. And they don't even understand the role that the highways played, how they acted as boundaries for communities in racially segregated ways, how people were displaced and replaced in segregated ways. They just think that this is the natural order of things. Those who resemble usually assemble, or something like that. When in fact, it isn't accidental. They don't think about the relationship between schools and housing. When you segregate schools, you segregate housing. When you segregate housing, you segregate schools. The public housing project that I grew up in remained racially integrated roughly 5 years. That's not long. And then it cycled, recycled, and changed rapidly and became segregated. And there were all kinds of consequences of that segregation, how policing was done or not done, who moved in the next wave of occupants, what kind of services were available in those communities and the schools that were connected with that community. Suffice it to say that it ended up being like most, or many, if not most, public housing projects. Drug-infested, poverty-impacted, a place where opportunity didn't come knocking very often. I remember the night that we will commemorate next year, almost, well, a little more than a year from now. I remember the night that Martin Luther King was killed. And I remember the violence that rocked American cities. It wasn't until his assassination that the federal government, the Congress, acted on what had been before it for some years. The push for a Fair Housing Act, laws to protect against discrimination in housing. It was only because of King's assassination that that law was passed. And in fact, what was true of housing was true throughout the civil rights movement, or that era. If you think about the major civil rights laws, each and every one of them were bought and paid for in blood. It was the assassination of John Kennedy that finally paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but not only that assassination, perhaps even more powerfully, or just as powerfully, it was the murder of Medgar Evers. It was the 4 little girls in Birmingham. It was countless and untold heroes of the civil rights movement that paved the way for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And it was Bloody Sunday, and even more martyrs, Viola Louisa, and others who lost their lives. It was John Lewis getting his head cracked open at the Edmund Pettus Bridge that paved the way for the passage of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And we can go on and talk about, as I mentioned, the Fair Housing Act of 1968. When I think about the post-1968 life of the Fair Housing Act, it was a statute that, in many respects, was under-enforced for a long time, even by civil rights organizations, including ones for which I worked. My first job out of law school was with the Justice Department and the Civil Rights Division, as you heard, in the Carter administration, at least for a while, before there was an election. First case I worked on was, at that time, a landmark housing discrimination case involving the largest suburb of Cleveland, U.S. versus City of Palmer. The City of Palmer made sure that low-income housing was not built in Palmer, at least not low-income housing that could accommodate families, because they equated low-income housing, family housing, with black folks. So they would allow low-income housing for seniors, because that was somebody else, but not for families. The city council president, whose name I remember, his name was Petruska, and he made a statement in a public meeting: "We don't want Negroes living in Palmer." Can't be much more unsettled than that. In any event, still, that was not uncommon at that time. Before I left the Justice Department, we filed the first case of its kind, and the last one. It was a case against the city of Yonkers, New York, and the Yonkers Board of Education. The idea was that schools and housing were inextricably linked. That had been recognized by the Supreme Court in Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Education, a case litigated by Julius Chambers. Usually I spend quite a bit of time telling people who Julius was, but I don't think I need to do that with this crowd. But the idea was to bring cases that recognize that link, and to try to desegregate communities in a holistic way. It was the last case of that kind that was ever brought. The administrations changed, the Reagan folks came in, they tried to kill the case, but got embarrassed by the optics of doing so. But there was never another case like that filed. And one could talk about the merits of trying to litigate those cases that way, but the idea was right about the connection between schools and housing. The whole desegregation process of public schools is a long, tortured conversation. But suffice it to say that the Supreme Court over the years has pretty much brought an end to public school desegregation. And if we are ever going to see a change in policies and practices that affect public school segregation, it's going to be because of housing opportunities. That's the only way it's going to get done now, because the Supreme Court doesn't appear to be going back, notwithstanding Justice Kennedy's refusal to join the four most conservative justices on the court in the parents involved case, he left the door open in theory to some desegregative policies and practices, but I fear that that's going to have limited impact. Some years later, when I was out in Los Angeles, made a tactical decision to begin filing housing discrimination cases under the Fair Housing Act that went after developments that discriminated. We started doing testing. I know there must be quite a few of you in this audience who have been testers, and we could talk about testing, the pros and cons about how that works, what you feel as a tester, even if you are not a bona fide housing seeker. But you present your face, and it's based upon your face and your identity that you lose what would be a housing opportunity if you were really seeking housing. It's not that you don't feel anything when that happens. In any event, we litigated those cases, but you know what? There aren't enough of those cases being litigated, and the damages were so low at that time that one of the things that we committed to doing was driving up damages because we thought it was important to make a point. And, in LA, if any of you have lived in LA or spent time there, LA juries are very generous with other people's money. But not so in housing discrimination cases. It was almost as if discrimination really didn't present that much of a problem. It wasn't worthy of a significant remedy that's measurable in dollars and cents when almost everything else with respect to violations of contracts or other rights, they were measurable in terms of dollars and cents. I could go on about the housing discrimination work that the Legal Defense Fund did and that others have done. Suffice it to say that I just think that this work remains so important, not only for its connection with housing opportunities, but, as I said, education, but job opportunities, really all aspects of people's lives. Where you live, tightly connected with your opportunities. Where there's a decent place to shop and eat. Just the everyday conditions under which people live that other people take for granted. What am I talking about? Well, just very quickly, having grown up in New York, and as I said, in the Bronx and in Harlem before that, I love those communities in many ways. But I know the effect of living in those communities with respect to violence, with respect to just the everyday conditions, the garbage that's in the street, the stores that are there and not there, the way that the houses that I have owned and bought in Harlem, in Brooklyn, brownstones, great houses, but their values double and triple if you find the same house in the same condition, for example, on the Lower East Side, just a mile or so away. I said the Lower East Side, I meant to say the Upper East Side. Or in Brooklyn, if you go to Park Slope, as opposed to being in Bed-Stuy. Now that's changing because Bed-Stuy is changing, and that's another conversation. So I believe that this is some of the most important work that we can do in our communities. I think also about other issues that are connected to housing. I think about, for example, I was rereading a Supreme Court decision last week in which the Supreme Court upheld the discretion of housing authorities to kick out residents in public housing developments that had somebody visit their apartment, not even live there, but if they visited, and even if unbeknownst to the resident, that person has drugs on them, they could be evicted. The Supreme Court upheld that. Now, I think that's wrong for so many reasons, and I won't go into telling you what my own personal view and thoughts are about the way drugs affect communities. It's an interesting thing to see the discourse about drugs nowadays. It's a very different one, from the one that was in play when I was growing up. The way the people I grew up with were demonized when they attempted to self-medicate themselves. Nowadays, all of a sudden, as we said for years and years, this is a public health issue, not an issue of criminal justice, because the face of drug users has changed. Actually, it never really changed that much. With all due respect, as I understood, because I did have an opportunity to go to school with white folk use a lot of drugs. I mean, I saw it. I know it. The point is, though, that the policies that are in place that allow people to be kicked out because somebody uses drugs, well, I thought to myself, what about the hypocrisy? Some years back, the then president of the United States, I'm not going to call his name because you can figure out who I'm talking about, had a brother who lived himself as a governor in a mansion that was owned by the state. It might be fancy, but that's public housing. And when his daughters had some struggles with substance abuse, nobody talked about kicking him out of the governor's mansion. Bring it a little bit closer to home. For those who argue that people, and don't misunderstand me, I know a lot of folks very close to me who engaged in a lot of substance abuse. I did not do it, not because I'm a saint, but because it just wasn't for me. I wasn't sticking anything in my arm. But here's the point. You bring it closer to home. The people who talk about people in public housing and demonize them, saying that, of course we have the right to kick you out. You're living off the public dole. This is public money that supports where you live. And my response to that is, well, you know what? I don't see any people being kicked out of their homes, privately owned homes, because they or their children use drugs. Even though they get the benefit of a tax break, public money, with respect to home ownership through a mortgage interest deduction. Why don't we ask those questions? And so, similarly, all of the policies being pursued that impact people who have served time, and we know what the criminal justice system in this country is, what it has been, what it continues to be disproportionately, and who it demonizes, who gets incarcerated. And as I said before, it's not that, well, I didn't say it in this way, but black folks don't use drugs in higher percentages than white folks. They get arrested more often. They get prosecuted more often. They get convicted more often. And they get longer sentences. But when civic death is the consequence after they come out of prison, where they can't find a place to live, they can't get a student loan, they can't vote, when those things happen, that is a form of discrimination and segregation. Michelle, help me. Alexander, Michelle is right. You know, it's the new Jim Crow. Thank you for helping me. I have a disease I keep telling the staff called CRS disease. Some of you are not familiar with it. The C is can't, the R is remember. Let me shift for a moment. I think about the project that I grew up in the building I grew up in, which is a 20-story building, 2 elevators. Half the time, if not more, after a while, at least one of those elevators was out of operation, often both of them. Yes, the building was crime infested. You went into the staircase, you didn't know what you were going to experience. You think about women coming home, mothers coming home, but not only mothers, fathers, and children. And you're in those staircases, people used to mess around and knock the lights out, and so it was dark in there. And if you were coming home with, your shopping carts, how did you get up 20 floors? The accessibility in general to those buildings, to people who were not abled in the way that most of us are, but most of us increasingly will find at some point in our lives a challenge in that respect. And so I thought about race and fair housing issues. I didn't think about the differentially abled. But of course, the Fair Housing Act was appropriately changed to apply to protect people who, in one way or another, had a physical condition that made it difficult for them to negotiate their way. So that was true. Same thing was true with families. Now, of course, I mentioned families and when I talked about this Palmer case, but discrimination against people with families. I mentioned just a moment ago discrimination against people who have been convicted of crimes and who have been incarcerated. A whole range of issues with respect to public housing, gender issues also. At the end of the day, I think about the Fair Housing Act and how it started, and I think about the fact that, like many of the other civil rights law, it started off focusing on race, but at the end of the day, it's made America and life in America better for all Americans. Most of us, sooner or later, if we are lucky enough, will have to confront issues of age and ageism. So in many ways, the civil rights laws have been opened up to apply to areas of justice and fairness and equity with respect to all of us. And so that's also true with respect to housing. I want to commend you and ask you to keep working on these issues. Housing is at the core of fairness in American life and opportunities, as I've pointed out in so many ways. Let me draw to a close and just share some very personal reflections that will be disjointed about where we are in North Carolina. Can I do that? Can I just have another few minutes? We at the center, as you know, are under fire by the Board of Governors, indirectly, sometimes not so indirectly, by people in the legislature. And I moved down to North Carolina a few years ago because Julius Chambers was encouraging me to do it. Jack Boger, former colleague at the Legal Defense Fund, and he had become dean of the law school. Other folks are saying, come on down to North Carolina and direct this center that Julius and others established, Gene Nickel. There are a lot of people in North Carolina who, when I got down here, talked about Gene Nickel in ways that are intended to make him a pariah. And he may have his own style. He does. But You know, I'm not one of those people who has a bad thing to say about him. You know, he speaks truth to power. You know, I respect that. But this Board of Governors and the legislature and others, it's not only true in North Carolina, but it's true around the country right now, engage in threats and intimidation and attempts to bully. And I've seen some of this up close now. And I see the impact it can have on good people, even courageous people. You know, when you have to think about your family, your income, your job, you know, this is what the stuff of McCarthyism was about. You know, people can hesitate, and it instills fear in good people. We cannot make concessions to fear. Can't do it. Because once we do that, it's over. We just can't do it. These folks are on the wrong side of the demographics of the country and of North Carolina, and they know it. And that's why their behavior is so outrageous. It's so mean-spirited. They're desperate. They're on the wrong side of history, and I always say they're on the wrong side of right. And so we've got to make sure that we hold on, because as Sam Cooke sang, a change is going to come. So the last thought I have to share is this. I also find myself having to be conscious of how interacting with these issues and these problems and these folks impacts me. I can't speak for anybody else, certainly can't speak for you, but I know it's very possible, and sometimes I find myself slipping this way. It's very possible to become so angry with these folks that I'm tempted to talk about them in ways that are hateful, be honest, because they hate us, and what animates what they do is hatred in one form or another. At least that's what I believe. You know, racism isn't dead, and a whole bunch of isms aren't dead. But I believe that I, speaking for myself, have to be sure that I don't give in to that, because it's corrosive, it's destructive, it's soul-killing. And that's a real challenge for me. I'm confessing. You know, that's a real challenge. I went to Catholic school for 12 years, you know. I always say that Catholic school education was my salvation and my damnation. It was my salvation because of the education I got. It was my damnation because once you get those nuns in your head, you never get them out. So I, you know, confession is maybe good for the soul, but it's bad for the case. So I think that we have all kinds of struggles, external and internal, in which we have to engage. But we cannot lose hope. We cannot give up. We cannot be intimidated. Hope is not something that comes to us serendipitously. You know, hope is a choice. Even in the face of all the reasons that exist to despair, you know, we choose hope. Because to do anything else is to lie down and die. Where are those little signs about your time's up that I said, you know, amount to? No. I mean, you know, hold that up. Time, I have to stop. Thank you.
Professor Shaw, thank you so much. We cannot extend our gratitude to you enough for providing us that wonderful history lesson of the fair housing law, as well as just encouraging us and educating us on what we need to do to move forward. Thank you so much. And on behalf of the Fair Housing Board, we would like to present you with the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board Leadership Award. It states it's presented to Professor Theodore Shaw. This award is presented annually by the City of Raleigh Fair Housing Hearing Board in recognition of outstanding contributions to fair housing. Thank you so much.